Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my master branch. So we're sort of like back in time for when we didn't have shopping cart functionality implemented at all. And now I'm going to implement a slightly different thing. I'm just going to implement like a buy now button that's on an individual product. So again, I'm not implementing the thing that you would necessarily need to finish your project requirement for checkout, but it's going to show you a lot of the same ideas, but it's going to be just for purchasing an individual product rather than a collection of products. And again, just thinking back to the shopping cart that we implemented, for the project, you have to bring in the concept of quantities. So you can't just be saving the IDs in an array in session. If you're going to go this session route, you'll probably need to be saving like a hash into that session array that contains both the ID and the quantity. And if the item's already in there, you like increment the quantity or modify that quantity. So it is a little bit more complicated than what I initially implemented. Okay, so we're going to use Stripe to implement our payment processing. So Stripe's just a company that has an API for payments. You hook in, your bank account details, and you can start taking payments by way of Stripe. Their business model is that they skim off like 3% plus 30 cents for every payment that you make, similar to what credit cards charge. They have a really nice API, and they have documented their API really, really well. And that I heard an interview with one of the creators of the company. This is now like $1 billion company, and their initial whole game plan was to bring this out and target developers to make it like as easy as possible for developers to integrate this into their system, because they were going up against some really, really big players like PayPal, for example, that's been around for years and years and was sort of seen as like the de facto standard. But PayPal documentation is not very good, like their developer documentation, and their API, because it's built up over a number of years, it's a little clunky. And so yeah, so they specifically built Stripe around this idea of like making it as developer friendly as possible. And there used to be, if I go to the Stripe docs, there used to be like a thing called checkout with Rails that was this really nice, it didn't take much time to implement. There's a gem, we're still going to use that gem, and you would you'd have this checkout button, and it would pop up right within your application like a little payment field, a little modal, and you'd fill it out and you'd click submit, and then it would tell you if the payment went through by way of an API request. That's now considered legacy. It still works. So if you go look up my old videos on YouTube, you can see the old videos that I've created using this legacy process. If you still want to use the legacy process, just due to its simplicity for your project, you can. Just know that it's no longer the sort of the way that you're supposed to do it with Stripe, and I can't guarantee how long it's going to be around for in this way. I imagine they probably have to persist it for a while because they don't want to have vendors that suddenly can't take payments. But yeah, I'm not going to be showing you that. I only discovered that it went legacy during class on Monday, because it went legacy right after the last run of this course in April 2019. So between Monday and today, I sort of played around and figured out how to do it in sort of the new way. And so that's what I'm going to show you today. I'd recommend just watching and not trying to code along, just in that like I'll probably be stumbling around trying to get this thing to work. And so yeah, so we'll go with that. So I'm going to start by adding the Stripe gem. I'll first start by checkout -b Stripe integration. I'm going to go to my gem file. I'm going to add the stripe gem, and then I'm going to do a bundle install, and the gem, it simplifies communicating with the API for you. So you can communicate with the API just with raw HTTP calls, but having their built-in gem it's really nice. Stripe itself is a Ruby application. It's not a Rails application, but the entire Stripe infrastructure is just it's a big Ruby app, and it got so big that they felt the need that they wanted types in their system. Like the one downside to all the flexibility that Ruby offers you is that there's no type system. So the engineers at Stripe have actually built a type system that they bolted on to Ruby, and they're in talks now with the core group that actually implements the Ruby language to actually get that type system brought in to the Ruby language, maybe as an optional typing system, maybe going forward as like, yeah, the ability to annotate types if you want to. Anyways, it's interesting to see that they were able to build a multi-billion-dollar company around an application that didn't have types, and then realized, well, we really want some type safety here, and then they bolted that onto the project. And open sourced it now, so you can play around with it. Yeah, okay, so that's there. I'm going to go into my config folder, and there's an initializers folder, and I'm going to create a new file in there, and I'm just going to call it stripe.rb. Any file in this initializers folder is just going to be executed on server initialization. So it's like a place where we can set stuff up. And so what I specifically want to set stuff up is Stripe gives me 2 API keys, a publishable key and a secret key. And this is how you communicate with Stripe with the API. You never give Stripe your secret key, but you tell the Stripe API what your publishable key does, and then it can encrypt stuff that only you can decrypt with your secret key. Hence, it knows who you are. And you never want to put these kind of keys into your GitHub repository, especially if you're pushing your repo up into a public repository. So I'm going to let you all see my secret key because I don't have any banking details associated with this account, so it's fine. And you know, I'm publishing this on YouTube, so now the world gets to see my secret key. I will cycle my key after this video. But it's just the test key. So I'm in test mode, and in test mode, there's just one credit card that actually works, and it's just the number 42 repeated over and over again. I still don't want to put these into my repo. What I want to do is I want to put them into environment variables at the operating system level, and then pull those in at runtime from my code. And so I'm going to do that like this. I'm going to go to the Rails object, and inside of the Rails object, we have this configuration object where we can put configuration stuff. And inside of there, I'm going to put in my publishable key as a key. And the way that Rails can read environment variables from the OS is we have a special hash called env, and it's just going to talk to your operating system and say, give me the environment variable that you have at the operating system level called, in this case, publishable key. And same thing goes for secret key. We're going to stash that in an environment variable called secret key. And then I'm going to go to the Stripe gem and set the secret key to be the one that I just put into here at position secret key. What that means is I now need to run my server with the provision of passing it a key. The easiest way to set up temporary environment variables in a Linux environment is just to set them right before you call the Rails command. And so this is all on one line. I'm saying publishable key equals, and there's my publishable key. I'm saying secret key equals, and there's my secret key, space Rails S. And so for the invocation of Rails S, both of those things will be available as environment variables. Now when the server boots up, it'll stash them into this Stripe configuration, and it'll take the secret key specifically and hand it over to the Stripe gem so that when I start communicating with the API, that secret key will already be in place. So that is step one. The next step is my routes. I want a few routes. These aren't really going to be RESTful routes because I'm not really dealing with like a resource like a model that's on my end. And so I'm going to use what's called a scope. And I'm going to put them all inside the checkout scope, meaning that they'll all start with /checkout. And then I'm going to create a few different routes. One's going to be called create. This is going to create a checkout. I want it to go to some kind of checkout controller that doesn't yet exist, and as checkout create. And then Stripe also asks you to have two routes available on your website, one called cancel, one called success, and it's going to redirect the user back to those routes depending on if they canceled their process or if it was successful. The new way of handling Stripe is instead of a modal popping up right within your application, when we go to pay, it's going to take us away to a Stripe page, pay there, and then it'll redirect the user back to our website after the fact. And it'll redirect to one of these two routes, the cancel route as checkout cancel, or the success route as in, oh, did I spell cancel wrong? I did. Cancel. And I want to delete that and call it success. And this as well. Okay, so those are the routes that are going to be in my system. I can see them. I go to rails/info. Just make sure that I didn't typo anything there. I have the checkout create path, the checkout cancel path, and the checkout success path. Two of them are GET requests that go to the correct actions, and one is a POST request that also goes to the correct action. That's good. That makes me happy. Okay, Rails generate a controller called checkout that has a, yeah, just that. No, that's not what I wanted. Success, cancel. 3 actions. And what I would like is, just like I did for the add to cart, I want there to be like a little button here where I click on it and I can like buy now, buy a particular product right now. So I'll do that. I'll do a button called buy now, and that's going to go to my checkout create path. I think by default the button is a post, but I will just ensure that it is a post. And I need to echo that out. I know. So clicking on this, great. I say great because nothing broke. It didn't do anything. By default, the button 2 is going to try to make that submission sort of behind the scenes. it's going to do it by way of like an AJAX request, and that's fine. That's how I want things to be. Maybe I'll just make sure that behind the scenes here, it didn't like do anything weird network-wise. Yeah. Okay. So a post to request. What's that? Oh, Jeremy, that's good. We currently aren't. And this is an instance where I can send it because my route doesn't know the product. My route doesn't have an ID in it. So here I can show the other way of doing things, the way that I was trying to do them before. So again, I could send the ID in one of two ways. I could make it part of the URL, or I could send it as part of a param. So I could say params ID product ID. Yeah, let me see if that's a thing. Clickety clack. If I click on it, I look here. What are you sending? Params ID 6. Yeah, okay, so now I'm actually, so it's like I'm submitting a form. In fact, it's not just like I'm submitting a form, I am submitting a form. There's one of the forms right here, and that form contains a hidden input where that ID is being submitted. So a slightly different way. We could have done the exact same way as we did with the add to cart by putting the ID into the URL. There's different opinions on whether you should use the URL for those kind of things or params for those kind of things. I don't have a strong opinion on either side of that debate. Okay, so that's going to hit my checkout controller. I don't need my products. I don't need this. I don't need that anymore. Or that. Or that. That's going to hit this right here. What I need that to do, there's my cheat sheet here. When I click those buttons, it happened behind the scenes. That's because it was being submitted like in an AJAX way. Rails has this neat thing where you can actually respond to different formats. I can have a respond to format, and you may have seen this if you looked into like a scaffolded controller. This is how Rails has like the separate kind of responses for HTML versus JSON. It also has a response which is server-generated JavaScript. And it's going to be a file that's going to be .js.erb. And so it's going to be actually a JavaScript file that we can have embedded Ruby inside of so that we can inject dynamic stuff from Ruby into our JavaScript before we serve it out to the browser. And so I'm going to say here, format.js. And what this is going to do is instead of trying to, at the end of this thing, render a create.html.erb, it's going to render a create.js.erb. And then at the top here, I'm going to go find the product in question from the params that I've been given. And that product variable should be available inside of this create.js.erb. So I need to make that file. It goes inside of my checkout folder in the views, create.js.erb. And just to have something working, I'm going to do a console log. And this is going to look weird, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to run some ERB inside of this JavaScript. This ERB is not running in the browser. It's running on the server, generating the JavaScript that is then sent to the browser that is then executed. So what should happen is it should, from the controller, pick up the product and inject the product's name into a console log. I also want like a bit of a guard here so that if someone's like messing around with my site in a way that I don't want them to, like if a params it gets sent that doesn't actually result in a product, that I just want to redirect to the root path and then return from this function and not try to do any checkout functionality. So I do a little bit more defensive-like programming when I'm dealing with things like monetary things, just because those are likely the things that people might try to monkey around with. So I won't even, like, what's going to happen here in between this and this is I'm eventually going to start setting up a Stripe session for payment. And so I won't even bother doing that if I don't have a product to buy at all. So let's see if this does what it's supposed to do. I'm going to reload this page. I'm going to bring up my JavaScript console. I'm going to click buy now on my rustic bronze chair. Oh, yikes, that didn't quite work. Undefined local variable product in your checkout controller. Did you mean product? I did mean product. Thank you for being so helpful. Back over here, rustic bronze chair. Oops. Rustic bronze chair. Click. Unknown format. Why don't you like that? Buy now button. Method is post. Do I have to explicitly say remote true? Clickety clack. Yeah, look at that. Ergonomic iron knife. And click this one, I get the next one. So I've successfully handed the ID of the product over to the controller by way of an AJAX request. I've dynamically created some JavaScript that uses ERB to inject the product name into a console log and delivered that JavaScript to the browser. This can also be done. There's some really neat stuff you can do with this pattern that gives you some of the reactivity that something like React or Vue would give you without having to bring in React and Vue, because inside of here, there's a way of like actually getting JavaScript to render partials for you that are your actual like Rails partials. And so you can click on something and then have pieces of the page just using the DOM change. And so that's how, when I used to want dynamic aspects to my website, that's how I used to implement them. And it's still like, if you don't need all of the power of React or Vue, you can do a lot of really powerful things with this server-generated JavaScript that we get. Okay, what do I need to do now? Well, now I need to communicate with the Stripe API. Okay, so the way that the Stripe API is going to work is before I shuffle the user off to a website for them to actually pay, I need to connect to the Stripe API and say, I need to set up a session Stripe API for a person to make a purchase, and this is what they want to purchase, and this is how much it costs, and their payment method should be XYZ. So that's what I have to do now. So I'm going to do that like this. I'm going to say session equals, and I'm going to go to Stripe, checkout session dot create, and I'm going to say that the payment method types, and we could put other types in, but I only want to pay by card in this case. And then line items, like what is this user actually purchasing? And in this case, well, they're purchasing a product that has a name and a description, which is a product that has a description. I actually don't even need this thing to be an instance variable anymore because I'm not going to use it in my JavaScript anymore. So I can like get rid of that. And then over here, this thing can just be a regular old variable. I have images for these, and you could even tell Stripe the image, and when it goes to the separate Stripe page, it'll display the image as well. But for that to work, I can't just be running on localhost. Because for that to work, Stripe wants to actually hit a live server, download the image, and cache it. And that's not going to work because I don't have a live server. So I won't pass the image. I will pass the amount that I want this product to be. And this is where Stripe wants the amount in cents. And the currency needs to be Canadian dollars. And the quantity is just going to be 1. Yeah, that's good. So those are my line items. And finally, I got to set up the success URL and the cancel URL. And those, well, I have defined those in my routes, right? I have checkout cancel and checkout success. So checkout success. And if I use path, I just get the relative path. If I use URL, I get the full URL, including the HTTP and the domain. So that's what I want. And then checkout cancel URL. And this needs to be a comma there. That looks pretty good. Let me just look it over. Payment method types. There's a single line item, which is a hash inside of an array. Success and cancel. And then I'm being shuffled off to this create. And so actually inside of this create, I need something else. Where is it on my cheat sheet here? Here it is. Setting up a variable that const stripe equals stripe. And so we're in JavaScript mode. By bringing in that gem, we also get access to some Stripe JavaScript. And I'm going to inject into that my publishable key. So remember, that's the thing I stashed away earlier in this configuration object. Position publishable key. And so that is getting put into a string there. And now I can go to this Stripe object and I can say redirect to checkout. And I've made this session an instance variable. And I need to specify here the session ID, and again, ERB echoing. So it's handy that we have this ability to echo into JavaScript. Close that and that. And this sends a promise back to me that if things go wrong, I'm supposed to let my users know what went wrong in the process. For the sake of this demo, I'm just going to do a console.log, which is not a good way to let your users know what's going on, but there you are. And I think that's all I need in this JavaScript. Setting up the publishable key to create the Stripe object, asking Stripe to redirect to checkout with the session ID that was set up inside of my controller, and then something in place for if things go sideways. I want to buy my ergonomic iron knife. Look at that. It brings in that information, ergonomic iron knife, there's the price, there's the description, the image would be there if I had provisioned an image. I can give it my email address, wallyclutton@example.com. Give it that's the testing credit card that they give you that always works. As long as you put in a date in the future and any confirmation number. put a postal code in, and I can click pay. Wait a second, do I have a success page yet for it to return to? I have a success that, but I don't have a view for it. Success, we took your money. Very professional. That was saved, yeah. Click this button. Ta-da! We took the money. If I go back to the dashboard and I go to my home here, this is the Stripe dashboard. Look at how much money I made today. Just dollar bills. And so I could go into the payments. I could see the session that I just set up, and I can see that it was successful. These incomplete sessions, so there's a side effect here, is if someone starts the process but they don't complete it, you get an incomplete session that gets garbage collected after, I think, 24 or 48 hours. And I can click in here, and I can see that it was an ergonomic iron knife that was purchased and the price, etc. There are some downsides though. One of the downsides is we get to this idea here of we took your money, but my Rails application doesn't know that things were successful, really. It sort of knows that the success thing happened, but there are some ways around this. The recommended way is to use what's called a webhook. And what a webhook is I would set up a route on my Rails app that is not for users, but is for Stripe. And so I would go into Stripe and I would set up a webhook saying, okay, I have an endpoint that I want Stripe to hit whenever payments come through successfully. And Stripe would hit that, and I would be able to say, okay, it would deliver like a payload to me. That would be some information around the purchase that just went through, and then I could actually go and stamp that thing as paid. In development mode though, I'm on localhost, so Stripe can't just hit a webhook. In some of the docs that I found, they recommended ngrok, which I had never heard about before, but looks super cool. What ngrok does is it provides a tunnel for you. It gives you a public-facing domain that will tunnel through to your local host. So you could set up a webhook at Stripe with an ngrok address that would then tunnel through for you. But then I also found that Stripe has a command line tool up on GitHub. And the thing that this command line tool will do is you can use it as a proxy for the webhook. So you can sort of run it locally. You give it your public key. It connects to Stripe and says, let's establish a testing webhook, and it would work that way as well. The way I'm going to show you a way that just really quickly that's a little bit sketchy. I would never use this for a production site, but it would get the job done. And so the idea behind this is if you want on success here, you can add something to this URL. You can add to your success URL a question mark session ID equals checkout session ID. What that means is when it redirects back to your success page, it will redirect back with its internal session ID for you. And then over here on the success page, I can load that session up. I could go to the session. I could go to the Stripe checkout session, and I could retrieve from the params hash the session ID. And then given that session ID, I can grab what's called a payment intent, which basically tells me whether or not this payment went through, how much money was paid. It even gives like a almost like a confidence rating on the credit card, like does this credit card look sketchy or not kind of credit card rating. And so I can do a Stripe payment intent dot retrieve using the sessions payment intent.
So this is an alternative to the webhooks?
This is an alternative to the webhooks, not recommended because it relies on the user being shuffled back by way of a redirect. If the user like quickly closes their browser, or they're on a train that goes through a tunnel and suddenly the network drops, like there's all sorts of things that could make it so that that doesn't happen, that they don't actually get redirected back. So you would never want to rely on this to like stamp something as paid. You would always really want to do the webhook route. I'm just showing this because if someone wants to be more of a completionist on the project and actually like figure out that this thing has gone through and they don't want to go to the extent of doing all the webhook work, this would be enough to show that you can at least get that information back. And so on success here, I'm just going to output a few things. I'm going to do a debug on the session that I just grabbed and on the payment intent. Oops, like that. So let me just see session, Stripe, checkout session, retrieve params at session ID. That should be coming from here. And then payment intent is Stripe, payment intent retrieve, and then I get the payment intent from the session. So let's try to buy another thing on my store here. Okay. Some intelligent iron shoes. Head on over here. Me. Gonna pay. This is the session that was returned back from Stripe. It's got a lot of junk in it, but you can see things like this is how much money I requested. If I go down to the payment intent, that's this one here, we can see not only the amount that was requested, but the amount that was retrieved. And so I could now check in my system if I just got what I asked for. Did I just ask for 85765 cents from the customer? And if I did, you know, things went through. I would also check to see, I think there's like, you know, paid true is just a Boolean to see, you know, that this user paid or not. At this point, I would do things like within here and within here, this session, Stripe is going to give me their internal customer ID. I would probably save that into my database. There's going to be a transaction ID, which could just be this payment intent. I'm going to save that to my database. So I would go and save a bunch of those things to my database, but I would also check to see if that payment actually went through by peeking at this payment intent. But again, this is not a real world solution to the problem. The real world solution to the problem would be to use the webhooks, because that would be much more stable than this. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong. But you can see here, that's how I got that information back. When Stripe redirected me back to the success, by having this little snippet at the end of that URL, the Stripe API put the session ID in the URL for me as a URL parameter called session ID, that's what gave me the ability to retrieve the session ID from the params hash and look it up. And then from the session ID, I was able to find the payment intent. And again, I was able to figure this all out this week really quickly, just based on how great their docs were. Their docs are just really, really nice in terms of, yeah, showing you how to do all the things. And so it was like the checkout docs that I was working through, specifically the one-time payment ones. And anytime they mention the API directly, it takes you over to the actual API. There's like full payloads, completely documented. And for any of the endpoints, it gives you like the Ruby code that you need to interact with the endpoints, or like you could, how to interact with it with command line curl, or if you're working with their Python library, or if you're working with their PHP library, or if you're working with their Java library. You see what I mean about developers? They're targeting developers here. They want this to be the absolute easiest way, so that a dev says, well, what's the least amount of work that I have to do today to get payment processing, for my company to work? And they're going to go to Stripe and say, hey, that's pretty easy. I can just copy and paste this code right into my code, and I'm done. And so, yeah, I think their business model was really, really successful. So that's all I got for you for today. I'll put all this code up on GitHub. I'll put up the 2 branches, the branch where I implemented the session-based cart, and I'll put the branch where I implemented this checkout functionality. Again, this checkout functionality is not complete. Oh, the one final thing I will mention, for the project, you also have to do taxes, right? And so I won't bother implementing this now, but one of the things I did before is you could actually make taxes as a separate line item, right? Because you can put multiple line items in here, right? So I could add a second line item here with a name of like PST and a description of like provincial sales tax. And then I could just straight up inline here calculate what that PST value is, do the same thing for GST as the line item, and suddenly I've added taxing. It's going to sum it all up properly for me at that checkout time. And so that's a way of implementing the collection of taxes into this way of handling Stripe, because it'll just be a line item for each of your taxes, or for those that apply depending on the province. Did you have a question, Sean? No, just resting your hand. All good. So thanks for coming to class today and listening to me talk about session and Stripe.